This comes from the book The Queen's Peace, The Origins and Development of the Metropolitan Police, 1829 to 1979, by David Ascoli. That's the London Metropolitan Police, in case you were wondering. It was written in 1979 for the 150th anniversary of the Metropolitan Police, and is an informative and well-written history, although no one should read it for exciting tales of daring do. It just isn't that kind of book. But then, all of a sudden, between chapters 10 and 11, on page 251, is Interlude, Change and Decay. It's so out of place and so very interesting that I thought you might be as interested in it as I was. It is divided into 4 parts. The most interesting are the middle 2, which is the majority of the interlude. All power corrupts, but it corrupts only those who enjoy the experience of being corrupted. Never was this to be more true than during the post-war years. The new society, with its vision of a synthetic utopia, its appeal to materialism, its tolerance of indiscipline, and its politics of envy, has much to answer for, both in its equivocal attitude to law and order, and in its tacit acceptance that the distinction between liberty and license is no more than a pleasant dialectical exercise at university high tables. The age of angry young men took no account of the silent and equally angry majority, and in its moral confrontation the police were to be sorely tried. Not all were themselves to escape contamination. These were to be the permissive years, a typically English euphemism for the devaluation of moral standards and justified by civil libertarians as the cult of virtue through the tolerance of vice. There had been nothing comparable since the 18th century, when wise and troubled Patrick Conaghan had written, "Evil will always drive out good unless good takes up arms to defend itself." Indeed, London in the post-war period had much in common with Rome in the years before the fall of the Western Empire, a city stifled by bureaucracy, decadent, corrupt, happily feasting on borrowed bread and circuses, its churches empties and its prelates marching from Aldermaston to Trafalgar Square. It spawned its own language, the spiv, the fellow traveller, or more precisely, the communist without the courage of his convictions, the beautiful people, the trip, demo, aggro, and the police holding that narrow line between anarchy and order were charmingly labelled pigs and fuzz. It took a Scottish crafter's grandson with Robert Peel's badge in his buttonhole to sum it all up. You've never had it so good. There are very few metropolitan policemen of the post-war period who would not find that a more offensive and provocative commentary on the temper of our times than all the radical invitations to public indifference put together. For consider some of the manifestations of this new Jerusalem. The traitors, Fuchs, Nunn May, Petticorvo, Burgess and Maclean, Felby, a new breed of men dedicated to the subversion of the very society in which they had prospered. The anti-Vietnam demonstrators who abused civil liberty to an extent that would have shamed John Wilkes. The militant trade unionists who defied the law and challenged the law to defy them. The urban guerrillas who sought by terror to overthrow an ancient, if yet imperfect, order of democracy. The immigrant tidal wave born of the dissolution of empire, which was to create for the police the most intractable of all their problems, hence Grosvenor Square and Grunsby and Notting Hill. To be sure, the criminal was never to have had it so good as the bleak statistics of successive commissioners' report rehearse year by year. Typical of the new morality was the growth of 2 flourishing industries, virtually unknown in the pre-war years, drugs and pornography. Add the liberalisation of abortion and homosexuality, whose financial possibilities were presently to prove irresistible to a small but greedy handful of detective officers themselves. In such a climate of decadence, Socrates, convicted of corrupting the young, would have been thought a folk hero. Yet in the sombre calendar of the years ahead, 2 other growth industry dominates all the rest, crimes of violence and juvenile delinquency. Neither was new. Both were to achieve levels which would have astonished Fieldings and even Charles Dickens. Of the 2, juvenile crime was and is the most serious of all post-war developments. There has always been vandalism, but how many of Lord Boyne's police telephone boxes would have survived for a single week today? There has always been hooliganism, but how many railway carriages were reduced to rubble by football and followers 40 years ago? This has nothing to do with Pascal's view of human nature. It has everything to do with the collapse of authority, both domestic and public. In no other city is it possible to find a parallel statistic to the fact that during a 16-month period of those arrested for taking and driving away a motor vehicle, 71 were under the age of 12.